I'm excited to have this opportunity to talk to you about how corn utilizes fertilizer and soil-derived nitrogen. Now, you may be wondering, why did Dr. Fernandez invite someone from Idaho to come and talk to you about nitrogen management for Minnesota? While I'm originally from Idaho, I've spent the last 6 years actually researching nitrogen management practices for Minnesotan corn cropping systems, as I was completing both my master's and my PhD degrees with Dr. Fernandez. And part of my graduate work examined how corn responds to different nitrogen sources. So in recent years, we've had a shift in what nitrogen sources are predominantly being used. So on this chart, you can see urea, different nitrogen solutions, anhydrous ammonia, and other sources, and how their use or sales over time have shifted. And so traditionally, anhydrous ammonia, as shown in green, was the predominant nitrogen source, but in recent years, it's really tail dived. And urea has increased. And a recent survey done in Minnesota showed that approximately 59% of all of Minnesota fertilizer applications are being done at pre-plant. And so pre-plant urea is actually currently considered one of the appropriate management practices for most regions of Minnesota, except on the coarse sandy textured soils. And that's because on these soils, the urea fertilizers easily and rapidly leach down the soil profile. And so other fertilizer sources or application timings are required under these conditions. Now, irrespective of the fertilizer source, nitrogen fertilizer rate is also one of the main drivers of corn grain yield production and fertilizer use efficiency. So as shown in this diagram, when we apply nitrogen fertilizer, typically the response in yield is typically linear up to a point, and then it starts to plateau off, where each additional unit of nitrogen returns a lesser yield. And so we don't want to apply too much nitrogen because we're not going to get the return on our investment. At the same time, each additional unit of nitrogen fertilizer tends to have a similar impact on potential for nitrate leaching loss up until we get to that similar point where then it starts to increase significantly. And so the goal is to apply just enough nitrogen fertilizer to optimize our yields and reduce our environment and minimize our environmental impact from fertilization. Now, the next thing that we have to recognize is that the role of fertilizer is to supplement the soil nitrogen supply. So annually, Minnesota's productive soils are mineralizing or supplying nitrogen to the corn crop, but the amount that they're supplying each year is variable, and it can also vary within the field. So that's going to be a factor of the soil, its weather conditions, the previous crop, how much organic matter was in that soil, and as well as field management. And so this makes it rather challenging to predict how much nitrogen the soil will supply in this growing season, and it can then make it difficult to determine what's the optimal nitrogen rate to apply, that we optimize our yields but minimize our environmental losses. An additional challenge associated with selecting the appropriate pre-plant nitrogen rate is that it's difficult to predict the future weather. So in Minnesota, historically, we receive about a third of our annual precipitation during the spring months of April through June. And during this period, annual corn nitrogen utilization is actually really low. We just planted, the corn crop is either just emerging, it's got a really limited root system, it really doesn't need that much nitrogen, but we've applied it all up at the front. But now we're going to receive about a third of our annual precipitation. And so this is actually marked by significant leaching events. Other studies from the upper Midwest have documented that this period from about April through June accounts for 62 to 72% of the total of the annual nitrogen load in tile drainage. And then on a coarse textured soil, it accounts for 72% of the annual nitrogen leached. And so this is a critical time period, especially if we're putting down pre-plant urea. And based on our past climate trend for Minnesota, you can see that we're warming, as shown by the darker red, and then having a greater amount of precipitation, as shown by the green in this map. And so it's expected that in the future, we're going to continue to have warmer temperatures and more increasing precipitation. And so the risk of excessive precipitation in those early spring months, it seems to be increasing. And so one way to manage that risk is through using split applications. Now, as part of my master's research, we looked at how does the timing of urea application, how does that impact corn grain yield? And so we had some field sites at Becker that has it's a Hubbard loamy sand. And then we applied nitrogen fertilizer as urea all at pre-plant at 120 pounds per acre. Or we split applied it with the 40 pounds of nitrogen as urea as a starter, and then 80 pounds at either the 2 leaves, 4 leaves, 6 leaves, 8 leaves, or 12 fully developed leaf stages. And as you can see by showing, as shown by the letters, where the same letter means that the treatments aren't significantly different for grain yield. Delaying our fertilizer application or that split application until V4 or later had the greatest improvement on corn grain yield on these coarse textured soils. Now doing this exact same experiment on some finer textured soils, so the clay loams of Waseca and or the loamy soils of Lamberton, you can see that there's really not much of a difference between the timings and the single pre-plant application. Now, while the master's research allowed us to see what the net effect of a nitrogen fertilizer rate, source, and application timing is on the corn grain yield and the end of season soil fertility, it didn't allow us to see how fertilizer-derived nitrogen was utilized in that soil corn system. And the reason for that is because when you apply a nitrogen fertilizer to the soil, you can't differentiate it from the soil nitrogen unless you use labeled nitrogen fertilizer. And so for this study that I'll be talking to you about, we did label our nitrogen fertilizer with a 15 nitrogen isotope. And so using this technique, it allows us to differentiate fertilizer nitrogen from soil-derived nitrogen, and then we can follow that nitrogen as it moves through the soil plant system, as it moves through the soil, as it is taken up by the crop, and we can quantify how much fertilizer nitrogen is in these different pools. Now, this research that I'm going to describe was performed at 6 field sites in 2014, 2015, and 2016. So we had 2 sites at Becker. That was a Hubbard loamy sand. We had 2 sites in Waseca. That was on a clay loam. It's a Webster Canisteo. And then 1 site in Lamberton, that's a Vest loam. And then 1 site in Clare City. That's a Beard and Qualm silty clay loam. And the treatment structure that we used was a 0 nitrogen check plot, 40 pounds, 120 pounds, 200 pounds of urea applied at planting, and then a split application of 40 pounds of nitrogen applied as urea at planting and 80 pounds applied at the V4 corn development stage. So first I'd like to talk about the fertilizer-derived nitrogen in the soil. Our first sampling event occurred within 8 days of labeled fertilizer application at planting. And so averaged across fertilizer treatments, we were able to recover in the top 60 centimeters of the soil 43 to 96% of the applied fertilizer-derived nitrogen. And so as you can see, the lowest recoveries were in Becker and Clare City. So at Clare City, it's likely that the low fertilizer-derived nitrogen recovery in the soil profile was due to volatilization loss. At all sites, urea fertilizer was evenly applied across the soil surface, and then it was at Clare City, it was incorporated using a hand rake, as shown here, whereas incorporated with water. So using a 1/4 inch of water or more. So following fertilizer application, urea is rapidly converted to ammonium. And if that fertilizer is not adequately incorporated into the soil, so typically you want to get it down 2 to 5 inches, then ammonia volatilization may occur, especially if the soils are warm, moist, and then they're drying. That seems to be the conditions that really favors ammonia volatilization. So if you go out and you apply urea fertilizer and you just leave it on the soil surface, the volatilization losses could be as great as 50%, or some cases even a little bit more than that of your applied nitrogen rate. And so in this study, although it wasn't done intentionally, it's likely that the hand rake wasn't incorporating that urea sufficiently into the soil profile to minimize that volatilization loss. And so this one individual field site really reemphasizes the importance of incorporating our surface applied urea soon after application to really minimize those volatilization losses. Now at Becker, it had 55% recovery, and that low recovery was due likely to leaching losses. So both urea and nitrate are extremely soluble in soil water, and they're easily leached through coarse textured soils. So within those first 8 days of fertilization, for each fertilizer treatment, most of that fertilizer was in the top 6 inches, as shown by these dots. But when you look at the 6 to 12 and 12 to 24 inch depths, you can see that about 7% or 5 to 20 pounds of the fertilizer nitrogen that was applied was found in those deeper depths. So averaged across all the treatments, 40% was in the top 6 inches, and then 7% was in the 6 to 12 and 12 to 24 inch depths, respectively. When we repeated this study again the following year in 2015, a similar pattern occurred. So we've got a little bit more nitrogen that's recovered in the 0 to 6 centimeter depth and more in the 6 to 12 and 12 to 24. But once again, that nitrogen is being leached down the soil profile. And the difference between the recoveries between these two sites is the amount of water that percolated below that rooting zone. So for the 2014 site year, we had 1.5 inches of water that had moved below that root zone, whereas in 2015, it was only 0.6 inches. Now, when we came back and took more soil measurements later at the 8-leaf development stage, there's only 33% of the fertilizer-derived nitrogen still remaining in the soil. And so this result reemphasizes why pre-plant applications of urea aren't recommended for these coarse textured soils. It just moves out of the soils too rapidly. Now, we often think that leaching is predominantly an issue for coarse textured soils, but in a wet year like 2014, leaching can also be a significant issue for finer textured soils. So at Waseca, within 8 days of fertilizer application, 46% of the fertilizer-derived nitrogen was recovered in the top 6 inches, and 12 and 26% was found in the deeper depths. So leaching isn't just an issue for coarse textured soils, it also can be an issue for the finer textured soils. Now, as was just noted in the previous slides, the majority of fertilizer-derived nitrogen is retained in the top 6 inches of the soil across all sites. And when I analyze the soil to see how much of this fertilizer-derived nitrogen is in the inorganic form versus the organic nitrogen forms, I found that 72 to 90% of the fertilizer-derived nitrogen is actually in that organic nitrogen fraction. So this could be that the nitrogen fertilizer was bound up by soil microbes, so they're using it to help to immobilize and break down any corn residue that was left in the fields. It may be being bound to soil organic matter, but it's primarily being bound up in that organic fraction. Now, this may be a positive result, as it may be a temporary binding of that fertilizer nitrogen, preventing it from leaching as inorganic nitrogen, especially since early on in the season, corn really doesn't need all that much nitrogen anyways. And so if it can be mineralized later on when the corn actually needs it, then that's a great benefit. However, if that rate of remineralization is slow or it's not synchronized to when the corn crop needs it, we can still be losing nitrogen from the soil system. And so this pattern of having the majority of the fertilizer-derived nitrogen in the organic fraction and the small fraction in the inorganic nitrogen, as shown in the orange here, or the gold color, actually continued on throughout the rest of the growing season. So what you're seeing here is we have the amount of fertilizer-derived nitrogen in the soil on the y-axis, and then 4 different sampling time, or the different sampling times over 2 growing seasons. So within 8 days of fertilizer application, at the 8 corn leaf development stage, tasseling, and post-harvest, and then the second year, where we came back to the exact same plots at pre-plant and then post-harvest, and then each of the 4 fertilizer treatments. And once again, the solid teal bars representing that organic nitrogen fraction, and the gold color represents the inorganic fraction. So as you can see, early on in the season, we have the majority of the fertilizer-derived nitrogen accounted for. But as we move forward in time, less and less of that nitrogen is accounted for. And from about post-harvest in the first year to post-harvest in the second year, there's really little change in the amount of fertilizer-derived nitrogen in the soil system. And so this could be due to that fertilizer being bound up in that organic fraction and just becoming part of the soil organic matter. And so it may mineralize slowly over time, but it's not mineralizing at a rapid enough rate to impact corn nitrogen uptake. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about nitrogen uptake in the above ground biomass. So on this chart, now we have biomass nitrogen. So the amount of nitrogen in the corn biomass on the y-axis, and then once again, the different sampling times that we looked at corn biomass. So 8 corn leaf development stage, tasseling, and then physiological maturity, and then physiological maturity in the second year. And once again, we're going to see the same color scheme where this darker color is soil-derived nitrogen that's being taken up by the plant, or nitrogen that's coming from the soil. And then the gold color is now the fertilizer-derived nitrogen. And then the percentage, or the value above the bars, represents the percentage of the total nitrogen taken up by the crop that is from the fertilizer. So for example, in this case, for the 200 nitrogen rate treatment, 50% of the total nitrogen uptake is from the fertilizer and 50% is from the soil. So over time, you can see that just like we normally would expect, the amount of nitrogen being taken up by these different treatments is increasing. But now notice how early on in the season, the percent of the nitrogen that's coming from the fertilizer is much higher than later on. So we'll just look at the 200 treatment. It's 50 at V8, 41 at tasseling, and then only 30% at physiological maturity in the first year. And so this indicates that fertilizer really has its greatest impact on corn nitrogen uptake early on in the growing season. And then as that corn crop develops and grows and its roots expand and explore the soil profile, and then as the soil is mineralizing more nitrogen, it's really the soil that is becoming the predominant source of nitrogen. And by R6, less than 31% of the total nitrogen taken up by the crop is actually less than 31% is coming from that fertilizer, and the rest of it's coming from the soil. Another point to consider is when we look at the single versus split application at the same rates. So that 120 versus the 40-80 split. So at V8, the split application significantly improved fertilizer-derived nitrogen uptake over that single application. And so we have 59% versus 37%. And this is due to that split application not being subject to nitrogen loss mechanisms for 20 to 30 days relative to the applications done at planting. And then that corn crop having a better developed root system so it can more effectively compete with the soil microbes for that inorganic fertilizer-derived nitrogen. But once you get to R6, there's not a significant difference between the amount of nitrogen taken up by the crop from the fertilizer between these two treatments. And then finally, at the end of the second year, fertilizer-derived nitrogen, it increased with increasing fertilizer rate, but the amount that was taken up was so small that it's not agronomically important. And so there's not enough residual nitrogen to be taken up by the crop, that's impacting the crop agronomically. Now, the last thing I'd like to talk about is how fertilizer-derived nitrogen was partitioned at the end of the first and second growing seasons. So now on the y-axis, we have the percent of, so we have the percent of the applied fertilizer-derived nitrogen. And then on the x-axis, we have the end of the year 1 or year 2, so physiological maturity in the first year or second year. And then we're going to see a series of stacked bar charts. And so the brown represents the amount of fertilizer-derived nitrogen found in the soil. The green represents the stover. The orangey gold color is the grain, and then the dark orange is the cob. And then the value on the top represents the total amount of the original fertilizer-derived nitrogen that we applied, what percentage of it is recovered in the entire system. So for example, in this 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre treatment, only 36 was still accounted for at the very end of the growing season. And it's actually a pretty consistent value across all the fertilizer treatments. 32 to 40% of the applied fertilizer-derived nitrogen is accounted for. So this means that we're losing about 60 to 68% of the fertilizer-derived nitrogen in that first year. And so this may suggest, or it seems to suggest, that pre-plant urea really may not be the most efficient source for years with extremely wet spring conditions. In drier conditions, it may be inappropriate. It may not lose quite as much. By the end of the second year, only 13 to 17% of the fertilizer-derived nitrogen was still found in that soil corn system. And the majority of that was actually found in the soil, as was shown previously. And so the lack of change, when you look at the brown bars here versus the brown bars here, it may indicate there's a very little change between the treatments over the 2 years. And so that may indicate that the organic fertilizer-derived nitrogen is actually fairly stable. And so it may be slowly mineralizing over time, but it's only providing a small amount of fertilizer-derived nitrogen to the succeeding crop. So in conclusion, based on this study, urea fertilizer is prone to nitrogen loss on all soil textures, more especially on coarse textured soils, but just as we saw in Wasika, it was moving down rapidly. And this is occurring especially in years where we have wet springs. Next, if you're going to apply urea, you need to really make sure that you incorporate it soon after applying it. Otherwise, you can have significant volatilization loss. And then fertilizer uptake is greatest soon after application, and that's really when that fertilizer treatment is having its greatest effect on the corn crop. And then the further away from that period of applying it, the less of effect that fertilizer is going to have on corn grain yield. And finally, we need to just remember that fertilizer nitrogen is a supplement to the soil nitrogen supply. It's not a replacement. Just as we saw in this study, by the end of the growing season, only 30% of the total nitrogen taken up by the corn crop across all the treatments was from the fertilizer. 60%, or a little bit more than that, was coming from the soil. And so it just reemphasizes how we need to really be doing our best to take care of these soils so that they can continue to feed us and to keep our farm sustainable for years to come. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge my funding sources, especially the Minnesota Corn Growers Association, who provide the funding for this project, as well as some fellowships that I was able to achieve to get to do my PhD, and of course the University of Minnesota field crew.